Please eat vegetable.
It's got zinc in it, dude. It's good for you. You know what else is good for you? Radio Free is episode 302. Because this week we're talking about a death metal project of the one and only Niklas Terror Rudolfsson, who you might be familiar with as the drummer for Sacramento.
야, 날 완전 제대로 잡아.
Yeah, he's not with them anymore. But given that they'd appear to be on that dawn release schedule of supposedly still being active but not releasing fucking anything since the 90s, except for one Merciful Fate cover, and the fact that he's played on everything they've actually recorded, I'm okay with still calling him the Sacramento drummer. He's also pretty famous for being in Swordmaster, a most excellent late 90s black thrash band helmed by the brother of the main guy from Dissection, or at least they were excellent until they changed their name to Death Stars. Then they kind of sucked.
No thanks, bro.
Niklas actually left before that happened because he's got a good head on his shoulders. But his main baby has always been the band we will be covering this week, that being Runemagick, who actually predate Sacramento by 2 years and are pretty well known in the underground for playing some kind of ultra doomy death metal. Incoming trademark Runemagick guitar trick. Play that same riff twice, but the second time you flip the pickup switch back to the neck pickup to get that weird smooth cavernous sound. Then you jump into riffs that basically sound like a death metal version of Candlemass. Coupled with those ultra low growls, you could see why this band, project, whatever the heck you want to call them, would be pretty darn popular amongst the old school death metal maniacs of the underground. I remember back in the late 2000s, a lot of people were citing this band as keeping the old school death metal spirit alive and writing a lot of really good riffs alongside the Chasm and Argus Length. And yeah, they got a lot of good riffs. And they were definitely out of step with the techie brutal death metal that was so popular at the time. Another cool thing about this band, his wife's in it. So he basically just gets to roll out of bed and start cranking out death doom albums. We call that living a dream. Squad goals. And it explains why there's so many friggin' Runemagick albums. Sometimes he would do like 2 in a year. And you'd think this sort of Runemagick stuff is what we'd be talking about.
But that's not what I'm gonna do.
Because I really want to talk about those first 3 Runemagick albums that were recorded prior to the stabilization of their current day lineup. They're stylistically very different from the Runemagick that most people are familiar with nowadays, and they're honestly 3 of the greatest death metal albums of all time, if you ask me. The first one in particular doesn't really sound like any other Runemagick album or even really any other band, outside of a few late 90s stylistic conceits. Supreme Force of Eternity brings forth this really majestic sort of death metal. If you're one of those guys that can't handle any sort of doom metal, then this is probably the Runemagick album for you, because while it is as heavy as their later material, it also incorporates a whole lot of very fast sections to the point where I'd even hesitate to call this a doom death album. It's more just like a death metal album that happens to have some slow crushing sections. But what really sticks out about this album for me is their peculiar method for layering these very dark melodies. It's incredibly subtle and almost hard to hear, but if you listen for it, you realize that every riff on this album has another melodic guitar layer sort of encasing it, which results in a much thicker and darker sound. One that often has more in common with black metal than death metal, at least until those really groove-oriented, almost bolt thrower-esque breakdown sections come in. But even those still incorporate that sort of subtle melodic layer if you really listen for it. Most of the songs on this album are quite long and incorporate a whole lot of different riffs and song sections. They tend to be very epic in scope and utilize a lot of different techniques from all over the metal spectrum. For instance, this riff right here, it's utilizing these sweeping black metal bar chords, but almost kind of doing an immolation style churning thing with them that I find to be interesting. Very close to A World Below. And from there, it jumps into the first truly doom metal sounding section of the album, which demonstrates probably the most easy to hear example of that sort of melodic encasing thing I was talking about. The riffs are harmonized, but they don't go out of their way to draw attention to the fact that they're playing guitar harmonies. So it all just sort of feels like this one sort of organism. And you can definitely hear why a lot of Argus Lent and Chasm fans were into this band as well back in the day, because they used much more expansive chord shapes than would be normal for the death metal genre. And they have that similar taste for the epic that those two bands did. Earlier on I mentioned that a lot of this album gets pretty darn close to black metal, and that makes sense because this album actually came out right before the final Sacramento album, Thy Black Destiny, and it came out a year after the first Swordmaster album, where they still retained a lot of black metal influence before going way more death thrash. Some of this album gets downright Burzamic with the layering, albeit they're still doing it in a very death metal sort of
Idiom, son? Idiom!
The best example of this more black metal aspect of their sound would have to be the song The Black Wall, which features a whole lot of that sort of melodic layering and all of its subtleties, as well as a very Capricornus from Graveland circa Thousand Swords style of drumming. Like Thousand Swords, this album is also a deeply emotional affair, which is perhaps surprising considering that it's a death metal album. But that particular emotional schema is both rather martial and rather reflective, kind of like an old warrior standing on top of a pile of defeated foes' corpses, which is pretty much what the album cover displays. I also really like the mournful sounding lead guitar that crops up from time to time over the course of this album. The album also takes a lot from Swedish death metal of the mid to late 90s variety. Particularly, it's an incorporation of what I would call the melodic death metal polka riff, which if you haven't heard, it kind of first reared its head with In Flames. And was perhaps most famously utilized by Amon Amarth a whole bunch. Runemagick does feature some similar sounding riffs, but with a much darker cast to them, befitting their stylistic label as a doom death band. Over that sort of polka, which has been slowed down to be a more trudging sort of riff, they also play a very black metal sort of repetitive droning tremolo picked riff, which results in a very different atmosphere than the folky divertimentos of In Flames or the militaristic heavy metal pounding of Amon Amarth. I like bands that can connect to on an emotional and lyrical level. Preach, brother.
Amen.
When he said, I really felt that, man. It's Morbid time. But enough of that silliness. Here comes another really good example of the sort of mournful lead guitar you can expect from this release. Supreme Force of the Eternity is a pretty darn essential death metal album. You should go and get it. What you shouldn't do is get it via the 2-disc CD reissue of the first 3 Runemagick albums entitled Dark Dead Earth, because for some reason the remaster job on that one is just awful. All brick-walled and modern Metallica sounding. It's just fucking yucky.
Why do we scream at each other? Come on! This is what it sounds like!
Getting that release back in the day taught me that remasters aren't always better. No, get the original. It sounds way fucking better, I promise. And speaking of getting the original, the second Runemagick album was actually the first one I ever heard. That's what got me into this band. Enter the Realm of Death, named after probably the best song on it, Enter the Realm of Death, that I first heard being covered by Crypticus on the 2010 Rites of Infestation EP. As soon as I heard the Crypticus version, I'm like, man, I gotta track this album down. This is where like the Doom stuff really started happening. I mean, the first part of the album is itself kind of a tribute to Candlemass's second album, Nightfall. And that it starts with this melodic guitar intro. It's about a minute long and establishes themes that will be expanded upon in the much longer song that comes afterwards. It's kind of a Codex Gigas, Well of Souls style dichotomy. And very appropriate for perhaps the heaviest doom death song of all time. I mean, just check out this heavy fucking pick scrape. This fucking riff right here, okay, that is balls heavy. Anybody tells you that doom death can't be real death metal? You hit them with this song, because this is probably some of the toughest sounding shit around. And I love those Candlemass style keyboards. Once that guitar melody kicks in, man, that shit hits like a truck. And the drumming on this album is super sick, which is to be expected since Niklas Terra Rudolfsson originally got fame as a drummer. Speaking of which, there's the man himself with some brutal fucking vocals, particularly during this super catchy part. Earlier, I kind of goofed on Runemagick's lyrical content with a lot of it just being raw. But I gotta say, lyrics to the song are pretty much perfect and do a really good job with this sort of story concept, particularly during this narration part, which is definitely Tall Man from Phantasm proved.
The funeral is about to begin, sir.
Leave this rotten life. And then he jumps back in with the keyboards and does the same sort of lyrical couplet, this time in the spooky death metal voice, which is always appreciated because this dude's got some sick fucking vocals. Perfect sort of funereal death metal atmosphere. And the way this song ends is fucking amazing because it revisits the melodies from that instrumental intro track, now given added morbid context due to the story of the song that unfolded afterward. Really effective coda to, like I said, one of the best death metal songs of all time. Whole album's great, but Enter the Realm of Death is a fucking standout. And then we get to the third Runemagick album, which for me is another one of the best death metal albums ever, and yet I never hear anybody talk about it. It doesn't even have any friggin' reviews on Metal Archives, and I thought this was like one of their pet bands.
What happened? Did your balls drop off?
Well, don't let the lack of press coverage fool you, because Resurrection in Blood is not only one of the best Runemagick albums, but much like the two albums before it, one of the best death metal albums ever, period. And this one's kind of cool because it incorporates way more sort of Swedish-style death metal, as well as some of Runemagick's best soloing. See right there, you got that punky sort of D-beatish Swedish death metal riff, and a sick fucking solo over it. It's maybe a little bit removed from earlier Runemagick works due to how Swedish it sounds, but I think it's good to have one album that sounds different. And as you're hearing now, that bouncy Swedish death metal is balanced very well with the more old school Runemagick doom death sounding stuff. Like this particular riff set here, which honestly reminds me quite a bit of Incantation, particularly in its incorporation of artificial harmonics. And then it gradually transitions back into that Swedish death metal sound. I know a lot of people really seem to hate Swedish death metal nowadays. I don't know if it's because that sound got so trendy with the retro revival movement, but when it's done properly like it is here, it's a great genre. Also, this cascading transition solo right here. That's fucking cool as hell. And the crushing doom death riffs that come after it are also incredibly well done. They come in very harsh, percussive, and blocky before sort of transitioning to this more bendy, smoothed out, almost kind of stoner metal sound that, after some nice early Edge of Sanity rhythmic and textural variation, resolves into some of the best death metal Candlemass type riffs they've ever written. Very sorrowful and morbid sounding without getting too sappy at all. You might also compare it to Autopsy, and that becomes even more notable as a point of comparison once the wah pedal starts to kick in, kind of presaging the more psychedelic direction that Runemagick would go in on their following albums after the lineup change. But this album, despite hints of what was to come, generally stays within that early Runemagick framework, and that includes the sort of black metal undertones to everything. Like this use of a droning root note is almost sort of a pedal tone. One might call it the Swedish death metal version of Le Legion Noir mutilation style stuff. From there it jumps into a more Autopsy-inspired section, but also utilizing a surprising amount of Incantation-style artificial harmonics. Like that one right there. You see, the other cool thing about these guys as a Swedish death metal band is they don't just sound Swedish, they incorporate death metal from both sides of the Atlantic. You got your Swedish death metal, you got your American death metal of the New York and Floridian varieties. You got maybe a little bit of Asphyx, so there's some Dutch in there. And there's also quite a bit of British 80s kind of slower doom grindcore stuff. Like this bit of total bolt thrower style goodness. Although much is the case with fellow Swedes, Cryptic Kerberos, I think these guys actually do it better than bolt thrower. Just my opinion, man. Anyway, this is probably the best doom metal riff of the album right here, if you ask me. When they harmonize over it, that's that good shit. And they unfold out of it with this total mid-paced bruiser of a riff. So check this shit. That's fucking sick. Whole album is amazing. Don't sleep on Resurrection in Blood like everybody appears to be doing. Like, come on, man. This is one of the best death metal albums ever. Nobody fucking talks about it. I don't know why. Even less than they talk about the other early Runemagick albums, which is already not nearly enough for my taste. Take that mammoth grinder and
Shove it up your ugly ass! You heard us right. Shove it up your ugly ass!
I remember earlier when I said we were only going to be talking about those first three Runemagick albums.
That's what made you did.
I lied.
I did want to talk about one of their later albums, specifically their fifth album, the second album they put out in 2002. This is sort of a weird era for Runemagick because they have the remnants of the older lineup with the two guitarists still existing, but you've also got Emma in the band now, and the music is sort of balanced as a bridge between early Runemagick and then their later more psychedelic death doom stuff. Requiem of the Apocalypse from 2002 seems to be the most popular album from this period, but I actually prefer the follow-up album, Moon of the Chaos Eclipse, that came out 6 months later. This kind of marks the final appearance of what I would call the original old school Runemagick sound, but it has enough of its own style to it with the incorporation of way more of that doom metal stuff that I think it's a bit of a standout in the discography. It's also very Eurodeath sounding. If you're into old school European death metal, you'll like this album. Also, it does a lot of that same compositional trick where they play one riff one way and then they play that same riff but a different way.
I like this one. One dog goes one way and the other dog goes the other way.
Like originally this riff started out all chunky and percussive, now it's tremolo pick.
Compositional dynamics.
Wow.
Anyways, here's a really cool transition sort of riff leading into one of the best groove death riffs they ever did. I mean, did you hear that? That was fucking awesome. Had that awesome groove with the awesome pinch harmonic. And then this lead guitar section right here comes in all floaty and atmospheric, really good stuff. And then they start incorporating their chugs. It's all appropriately dark and brutal. And of course, they got to bring that awesome opening riff back.
Like getting money at his back.
Moon of the Chaos Eclipse, great fucking album. Resurrection and Blood, amazing fucking album. Enter the Realm of Death, outstanding fucking album. And Supreme Force of Eternity, utterly unique sounding, really cool, black, doom, death, whatever the hell metal. Don't sleep on Runemagick, man. This is some good stuff. Don't tell anybody, but I might actually like Runemagick a little bit more than that last Sacramentum album.
너는 산이야 바다야?
Now, don't get it twisted. I like that last Sacramentum album, too. From what I could tell, pretty much everything Niklas Terror Rodolfsson has been involved with is pretty fucking sick. One of the few old-school Swedish death metal personalities that's still keeping it real to this day.
I keep it real.
I've been listening to a lot of his other band that he was in, Swordmaster, lately. Maybe I should do an episode on them at some point. But Runemagick, man. Get you some Runemagick. It's good stuff. Hopefully you agree, but even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
I pull down my pants and she looks down at my cock and she says, "Oh, hell no." I said, whoa, what? And she goes, "That's way too big."